listening to the Tenderness Revolution, a podcast about the stories of kindness, compassion, and empathy that play out in our lives, because these deeply moving experiences describe what it means to be human and invite us into a new way of thinking about the world and each other. I'm your host, writer and journalist Yvonne Gavin, and every episode I'll be asking a new interviewee about a pivotal moment of tenderness that helped shape the course of their life. In this episode, I'm talking to Ebony Gilbert. These days, Ebony describes herself as a writer and truth teller after years of carrying around the shame of her past, which involved abuse, addiction, and success in the public eye, followed by a difficult introduction to new motherhood. Talent spotted by a top London model agency at the age of 13, Ebony went on to work as a page 3 glamour model and then actress, appearing in a number of films. She featured in all the newspaper gossip columns and seemed to have an amazing career, but she was also battling an addiction to alcohol and drugs. After going through rehab, she met her partner Steve and became pregnant with her son George, who she describes as the love of her life. Weeks after the birth, Ebony and Steve discovered that George was blind, and he has since had multiple diagnoses, including autism and learning disabilities. She lives in East London, where she works as a birth doula and poet, and Ebony's new collection, This Skin I'm In, has just been published. Ebony exudes beauty and is truly one of the most honest and open people I've ever spoken to. During our conversation, she shared many of the difficult and traumatic experiences that she's been through and reflected on how she's been able to deal with them. Her mission to tell the truth is truly inspiring, and I really hope you find comfort and hope by listening to our conversation. Hi, Ebony. It's lovely to see you. I'm really happy to have you. I'm so happy that you're here on the podcast with us today. I'm really
Thank you very much.
Yeah. It's so nice to see you in London.
Yes, it's a proper freezing, the first kind of freezing autumn day today, and it feels quite lovely, actually. It's nice and sunny and cold and bright, and yeah, lovely.
Oh, I love those crisp autumn days. I do miss them. I do. But I have to say, I also quite like to see the sunshine here in Botswana.
Yeah.
It's
I wouldn't mind being in Botswana in the sunshine, I'll be honest.
Well, it's the beginning of summer, and I always find it a bit disorientating because I always have to keep reminding myself of the month. It's like, it's the beginning of summer. It's October. It's not autumn. It's not the beginning of winter. It's the beginning of summer. So I still get disorientated by it, but yeah, I do appreciate it as well. It's beautiful. So I'm so looking forward to our conversation. There's just so much about you that's fascinating, and I think our listeners are going to really get a lot from this conversation. But I want to start, as I always do, by asking you to share your moment of tenderness with us, because the idea behind the Tenderness Revolution podcast is that essentially our lives are made up of all these little stories stitched together. And when we shine a light on scenes where we felt a profound sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves, moments where we felt seen or understood, or that we had a deeper relationship to the world around us, it's as though we're awakened to a greater sense of meaning and purpose. So I'd love to hear your moment, Ebony.
That really helped, actually, just hearing you talk about tenderness in that way, and just helped me kind of drop into my heart and think about my moment of tenderness after a frantic morning of shoving my child out of the door and I'm not tender at all. When you asked me to do this podcast, I was really thinking about so many moments of tenderness that I was finding it difficult to actually pinpoint the one, if you like. And you know, in my thinking brain, there was this and there was this and there was this. And then in my heart, the same moment just kept coming and coming and coming. And And it's not something I've ever spoken about before, so it feels quite vulnerable to talk about. But the moment that I can pinpoint as you know, it was a life-changing moment, was the day that it was like I literally woke up one day and I forgave myself for all the self-hatred and blame that I had heaped upon myself for my son suffering brain damage when he was born. And there are hundreds of moments before it and after it, but there was a very specific moment that happened. And it was like, you know, for 4 years prior to this moment, and I'll tell you more about that later, but for 4 years prior to this moment, it was, this must be my fault. I must have done something or not done something that caused this. And I am a terrible human being. And if people knew who I really was and what I'd done, or, you know, could, you know, all this just dreadful self-blame. And I'll tell you the exact moment. I'll tell you what happened, just to put it all in context. So that we had this amazing acupuncturist that was treating our son for his stroke, and because he's nonverbal, and she works a lot with the kind of speech and language center of the brain. And so she had been treating him, and, you know, we're not rich by any we're not, but we would put all of our money and all of our effort and all of our time and all of our love into our son. And it was like, you know, we will find the money to pay for the best specialists to treat him and to help him as much as we can. And I remember one day, Mandy, the acupuncturist, she said, I think it would be really good for me to treat you. And I was like, oh, no, I can't spend money on treating me. You know, it's all about him. And she said, no, I want to treat you. And I said, okay, I'll have a session. And during the session, bearing in mind, I had cried, I'm not exaggerating, a million rivers of tears about his birth before this moment. But what happened was, the acupuncturist, she put a particular needle in me and I started crying, right? Which is not abnormal for me. I cry a lot. So I started crying, and Mandy said, yeah, she said, you're letting it go now. And I said, I'm thinking about George's stroke and the brain damage and what happened to him. And she said, yeah, it's time to let it go from your body now. And she said, yeah, I can see that you're letting it go, as I was crying. And I honestly, I was a little bit cynical, I was a bit skeptical. And I said, Mandy, I said, I've cried about this 1,000 million times. I said, this is just another cry. It's, you know, it doesn't mean anything. It's just, I will always blame myself for this. And that's it. Anyway, I went home, had my evening, had my dinner, put George to bed. And the moment was, the strangest thing happened. I woke up in the morning the next day. I was literally right here as I am now, sitting on my bed. I opened my eyes, and it was almost like a voice came into my head. It was my voice, but it came independently of me. And it said, oh, it wasn't your fault. And it was like, it was almost like somebody had just told me the simplest thing in the world. Like, of course it wasn't your fault. And I sat up in my bed, and I just was like, I felt kind of casual and breezy. It was really bizarre. I was like, of course it wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything or not do anything. I couldn't have changed what happened. It had nothing to do with me. Of course it wasn't my fault. I forgive you. And it was just, I'm kind of laughing about it, but it was like this. I don't even know what the right word is. It was like I had been, it sounds a bit cliche, but been carrying around not just a rock, but, you know, had been dressed in rocks. It was like I had been wearing a coat of rocks and a hat of rocks and shoes made of rocks for 4 years, which really hurt. You know, were really not just really, really heavy, but really, really fucking hurt my skin. And it was almost like somebody had just gone, oh, you can put that down now, carry on with your life. And that was it. And I haven't blamed myself since that day. And that all sounds quite magical and fantastical, but that is my experience. That's what happened. And, you know, there's still been a shed load of processing and talking and navigating the whole situation. But essentially that day, something changed, and I realized that I am a person who has always self-blamed and been full of shame. It's just who I am. So of course I was going to also blame myself for this. And what worse thing to blame yourself for than your son not being able to walk or talk, or, you know, what worse thing to torture yourself with. So that was probably a bit longer than I expected for the actual moment. But the moment was I woke up and I forgave myself. That was the moment. Yeah.
Wow. Ebony, that I really was struggling not to sort of well up, because that's incredibly moving. And I think what's particularly amazing about that moment is how visceral it is, and how I'm sure that, you know, so many of us can relate to the feeling of like that weighty, heavy feeling of negative emotions in our body. And what you had been through was real, difficult, deep, dark trauma and pain. And I can only imagine the weight. I mean, I love the way you describe it as, you know, rocks on your body and on your, like a hat of rocks and shoes. It must have been so heavy, so heavy. And how I truly think how amazing you are that you were able to come to that place after only 4 years, because it's not really very long after such a traumatic event, to have been able to gain some awareness and insight actually over what you were carrying around. Interesting that it did happen in a physical way. So it wasn't really the kind of talking therapy that triggered that feeling of being able to let something go, or that voice that opened up, that voice of course it's not your fault, of course nothing is your fault, of course, you know, it wasn't actually a thinking realization, it was an embodied realization.
You've completely hit the nail on the head. It was a complete body sensation. I had talked it to death and cried it to death. And, you know, one of the things that I've been aware of for many years now is that, and I know that most people do this, and most people have these kind of psychosomatic experiences, but as a person who naturally feels very, very deeply, and who naturally is an addict who wants to get away from those feelings, what I tend to do is to split off my head from my body and feel everything in my body, so that I don't have to think about it and acknowledge it, and I don't have to feel it. And I always had this thing of like, you know, yeah, I'm talking about it and this is really important and I'm crying about it, but it's stuck in my body. And, you know, I had said these same words over and over again when I'd been doing trauma therapy for 10 years, you know, 11 years prior to my son being born as well. And I kept saying I'd go from therapist to therapist to therapist, and I'd say, you don't understand, it's stuck in my body and I don't know how to get it out. It's in my body.
Yes.
And this relationship between the head and the body. And you know, at that point, I hadn't really gone into the kind of body therapy and the body work. And it was when I started doing that I thought, oh, this is very, very interesting. And you know, have used it for so many other things since. You know, I feel like that kind of body work alongside the other stuff has changed my life. It has revolutionized the trauma, you know, the trauma of his birth, you know, my original trauma of being a survivor of abuse. And, you know, it's been such a long journey to almost get the head, I say the head, of course, because I'm a dissociated person, my head to the head and the body, my head and my body. It's been such a long process to get them to kind of come back together and just click it back on. And sometimes it wanders off again and I'm like, oh, where's my head gone? Oh, it's over there. try and bring it back, literally. And yeah, I'm a headless corpse sometimes, and that's okay. And I feel great though when I can put my head back on. I'm like, I'm here. Hello, I'm all connected. And yeah, connecting mind and body.
Yeah, it's that thing of dissociation, isn't it? You know, Gabor Mate. I'm sure you're aware of his work.
Yeah.
And that's the way he described it, isn't it? The trauma, and that it's that disconnect. That's actually what trauma is. It's that moment where you split off, and you know, in order to numb and not feel that trauma, you split. And that's exactly what you're talking about. And that's so fascinating. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that with you in more detail. But I just wanted to ask a bit more in relation to this, the moment that you described and this process of letting that shame go. Did sort of a feeling of tenderness come in? Was it a tender self-compassion? Did that come in, and did that then manifest in your life? I mean, it might not be as concrete as that, or that as easy to identify, but is that what happened, or was it a very, very subtle, gradual thing?
No, it wasn't subtle or gradual. And it was, I can literally look at photos of myself before and photos of myself after, and I look like myself again. You know, I look like my skin looks more radiant and glowing, and, you know, my eyes look brighter and lighter, and I look better. I look like myself. And I remember my partner saying to me before this moment happened, I remember I was lying on the floor on the rug in the lounge, and we were having a conversation, and he said, you know, he said, I know that what we've been through and what we go through on a daily basis is really difficult and painful, and it's hard to let go of. He said, but he said, you are losing yourself. You are not yourself anymore. You need to find yourself again. You need to find some joy again, and find you again, and do things that you love. And even though we had this conversation on it was a rational head conversation, and I felt it in my body, I felt it, but I couldn't do those things. I thought, I know what you mean. I used to write, and I used to go out and see my friends, and I used to wear red lipstick, and I used to, you know, have baths and light candles for myself and do this shit for myself that I actually deserve. And for that period of time, it just completely went out of the window. And, you know, it just started coming back. And, you know, of course, it has waned again, you know, as other bits of shame have come in, and other bits, you know, other things that I've struggled with, you know, have come in. But even, you know, I remember being in therapy, and I remember saying to my therapist, I said, I want to buy a duvet for my bed. And he was like, okay. Okay. And it was, I'd kind of just realized, I thought, I've been sleeping under a sheet for, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years. I think I had given the duvet, because my son likes to sleep on the floor instead of on his bed. I think I had taken the duvet off my bed and made some extra padding on the floor. And I then had this sheet on the bed. And one thing that I absolutely love is a bed that looks lovely, with, you know, really nice cushions and a nice throw and a nice duvet. And on a sensory level, as somebody who, you know, has ADHD and somebody who has had a lot of trauma, one of my most comforting things in life is to wrap myself up in a big, cozy blanket or duvet. And I realized, I said to my therapist, I'm going to buy myself a duvet. And he said, have you not got a duvet? And I said, no, I haven't had one for a couple of years. And I came home that day, and I suddenly realized, I was like, wow, like, I feel sad that I have been quite chilly under a sheet for quite a long time, you know, in the winter. And it makes me feel really, really sad.
That's actually, yeah, that's really sad. That's a manifestation of how you felt about yourself, isn't it?
Yeah, like really felt undeserving. And, you know, I literally went, and, you know, I was aware before that I hadn't bought myself a duvet, but I just thought, oh, I haven't got time, you know, I haven't got the time, or, And actually, you know, I had time to do, you know, round the clock care for my son, and, you know, time to help other people do things for themselves. And it was a real turning point.
Yeah.
It was a real metaphor for me. I realized, I thought, okay, something is shifting here, and something is changing, and I am becoming more tender with myself, and I am coming back to, you know, me and what I deserve, and forgiving myself.
Connecting to that deep sense of who you are, connecting to your true self, and realizing that, you know, you had been neglecting that so profoundly. But again, such a common experience, I think, for so many women, especially those with special needs children who have so much they have to give and give and give, and you want to give, you want to do that. Like you want that more than anything else, but you also need to be like, that's why tenderness is all of it. It's tender to all of it. It's tender to yourself and tender to others. And they really need to all come together, because otherwise something's going to fall apart.
Totally. And what's interesting for me is that, you know, my son is 6 now. And so for those first 4 years, while I was carrying all that shame and self-blame that, oh, it must have been my fault, I didn't, in inverted commas, I didn't have time to do anything for myself. I still have the same amount of care that I need to give now. And, you know, he still has all the same needs that he had before. Yet I also have found the time to do things for myself, and to have little breaks, and to say, this is what I need. And so that would suggest that the time, you know, yes, it's very difficult to get it, but it was there. If only I could,
sorry.
Just to have that, the deservingness is not a word, but the deservedness, you know, it's like you can find it if you feel like you deserve it. Yeah.
And I think what's interesting as well is to kind of observe, what was it that was preventing you from finding that time before? Something was. So you mentioned that you were an addict, and I know that's part of your former life, Ebony, but it seems like so much of what you do is around becoming whole, as though you're acknowledging the shadow parts of yourself, which we all have, and accepting them as a crucial part of who you are, or the skin that you're in. And it's like you've said on Instagram, sometimes I delete my own posts because I'm not the same person I was 4 minutes ago. And I just wanted to ask you about your earlier life, because to go back, you started modeling at a really young age, didn't you? Actually at 13. And then you went on to do various bits of acting. You appeared in a number of different films. You were even a glamour model for a while. You were on TV. You went to all the parties and appeared in all the newspaper gossip pages. And it seemed like you had this amazing career, but that's also the time that you were battling with an addiction to drink and drugs, isn't it? And then in the space of a really short time, you had your son, you became a special needs mum, and now a birth doula and a poet. And I wonder if it feels as though you've shedded that skin, or the skin of the person you were then, or if you embrace that part of you with compassion and still feel that she's very much a part of who you are now.
I think for so many years of my sobriety and my recovery, I really tried to actively disown those parts of myself that I felt shame around, and, you know, felt like, had these fears that people would know that I'd been a paid street model, or know that I was an addict, and would, just reject me or judge me. And, I think I started modeling when I was 13, and I was spotted by like a really big fashion agency at the time, and went into, doing loads of great work. Unfortunately, I didn't grow, so it didn't last very long because I'm only 5'3". I think they were hoping I might stick on an extra foot along the way, but didn't happen. But that was actually around the same time that, you know, my eating disorder started and I first picked up alcohol and drugs. And then when I was about 17, I decided very suddenly that I was going to leave college in Nottingham and move to London and be a paid tree model. This is, you know, I was like, I'm doing it overnight. I don't know anybody there, but I'm off and I'm doing it. And, you know, I think that felt like the ultimate in being seen, and in my young mind was, you know, getting attention and feeling valid and worthy and accepted. And so when I moved to London, that's when probably about a year after I moved down here, the addiction really took off and other drugs came into play. And so it only lasted maybe, let me think, about 5 years, but I pushed myself to the very, very limits within those 5 years. And people often say, oh, you know, you came into recovery so young, you were only 23. You know, how could it have been that bad then? And I'm like, oh, it was that bad. And I'm actually really grateful that I fast tracked through it and that I did come in when I did come in. But as I was saying earlier, you know, for probably up until only the last year or two, really, if I'm really being honest, I really wanted to deny those parts of myself. I literally wanted to just delete them. I thought, I don't want them to exist. I don't want anyone, I'd be mortified if anyone came across the pictures, and, you know, I don't want anyone to know. And I think a lot of the writing the poems in the book, it felt like, and I didn't set out to do this on purpose. It felt like I was, with each poem, claiming different parts of myself. So, you know, there was one about the 9-year-old me, and then there's one in there about the 14-year-old me, which is when everything felt really difficult and painful. And, you know, there's one in there called Chalk Mark, which is about being 17, moving to London and just kind of leaving myself behind and just going, I'm going to be a new person. I'm going to transform myself. And, you know, at that time, it was, you know, 17, I was like, I'm going to get a boob job and I'm going to look like this and I'm going to be a different person and everything will be okay. And again, when I got sober, it was like, okay, get rid of her. You know, I wanted to dye my hair brown and get rid of the implants and just be a different person again. And I feel like through the writing of the poetry and through the therapy that I've done, I just feel like I've kind of gone back in time and scooped up those selves that I'd kind of thrown away. You know, I've kind of got them all together and go, right, 9-year-old self, I love you, I'm here for you, I hear you. 17-year-old self, I love you, I'm here, I'm not embarrassed about you, I'm not ashamed about you. You know, I can still have my moments of like cringiness, if that's the word. But generally speaking, all of those parts live within me now, whereas they were scattered and I never felt whole. And I feel like, you know, the writing of this book feels like that process of getting all those bits and stitching them all together. And there's a line in one of the poems which is, I will mend you. I will mend you. And it very much feels about almost like my body is a tapestry and going, okay, I'm going to stitch this part on that had been dissociated and, you know, literally thrown away and covered up and wanted to be erased, and all those things that we've all been through. We've all been through our own stories and our own traumas and losses, and, you know, we carry those in our body. And my wish before was to cut off those parts, literally cut them off, I thought. And I remember hearing a story years ago about somebody who had this obsession with wanting to have one of their limbs amputated. And I remember people being like, well, why would you want to do that? I don't understand. And I remember thinking, I really get that. You know, I really identify with that feeling of like, I sometimes would say, if I could just throw my head away, and actually maybe my body as well, then I'd be okay, because it's so difficult living whole, you know, while you're feeling so disconnected. So yeah, a lot of the journey of sobriety and recovery and the writing of the poems, that's what it's about. And that's, I'm not perfectly whole and joined up on a daily basis. When things come along that wobble me and make me feel scared or shocked or in grief, I still dissociate first before I feel and integrate. But yeah,
you're aware of that. You notice that you're doing it, and then you're able to bring an awareness and then actually re-assimilate. So that's really incredible that you're doing that.
Yeah.
And also your new book, the cover, what's really beautiful about it is it does actually have an image of you naked on the cover, but in a very different way.
Actually, a friend of mine, Hannah, I lived with 2 Hannahs in Notting Hill when I was 17 in this crazy party apartment. And all 3 of us would, we were all kind of doing glamour and, on that kind of party scene. And Hannah commented only this morning on Instagram, she saw the cover of the poetry book and she said, who'd have thought 20 years later that you're appearing topless again on the front cover of something? And I was like, yeah, because I've been wearing practically crinolines for the last 15 years. Like, oh my God, I'm embarrassed. I don't want to. And now I'm like, yeah, this is my body. These boobs are not the perky implant boobs that were airbrushed and glossy on in the magazines and the newspapers. They're different. They have breastfed. They have been rearranged multiple times. I've had implants in, I've had implants out. Then I had a bleed and had them had to go in again and have them rearranged. So I've got these physical scars, like anchor-shaped scars on my breasts and around the nipples. And, it's the same body, but it's the one that's got my cesarean scar on it and my appendix removal scar. And all of those bits are part of my story and part of this body. And it's not kind of perfect and shiny. It's a real body. And, there's a little shelf of baby fat hanging. I'm like, I just had a baby. It's like, well, it was 6 years ago, but but it's just a real body, and it feels
real
good to be circle and going, yeah, here it is, and the story around it being my torso. At first I was like, no, put a really perfect torso on there, one that's not mine. And now I was like, no, this book is about me and my stories and my book. It's going to be mine that's on there. And that feels really special. It feels really special and a bit embarrassing when, like the mother-in-law looks, it's like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, that's me.
Oh, that's a bit different.
Oh, that's different. Are those your nipples? That's right, they are.
Oh, I love that thing of coming full circle, but it's real and really beautiful in a sort of whole way. It's like wholly you with, in your fullest, truest sort of self. It's as though you've really become fully who you are through this process of growth and assimilating all of yourselves and then deeply accepting those selves. I think that's really the part of it, is that thing of acceptance. And then, like you were saying, through the poems, actually bringing all of those parts of you into the work and saying, yes, I'm bringing you into the light. I want you to be here because you're part of me, that full, true, real part of who you really are. So,
just wanting all of those parts to be acknowledged and seen and heard, even if only by me, even if nobody ever read the book. Just to say, I acknowledge your existence and I accept you and I love you and I'm here and I hear you. I hear that you feel shame sometimes. I hear that you're frightened sometimes. And just to in therapy there's so much talk about reclaiming your inner child and going back to get them, and that's been so important for me, but also so has going to get the other selves as well, the teenage self and the young adult self and the all of those parts, the little kid and the baby. And it's like they've all been we have all been through our own versions of events, and it's like but we're all living in this same body, in this same skin, and the body carries our experiences, and if we don't deal with those experiences, they really manifest into physical illness and mental illness.
Yes, absolutely. They do. And you mentioned also previously about some of the diagnosis that you've had as yourself as an adult, the ADHD. And I was interested in whether you think that some of the addiction and the addictive behavior was a kind of an attempt to almost block out those really overwhelming feelings. So you've mentioned about things like clothing, finding certain types of clothing uncomfortable now. And I wondered if before, like if obviously that's always been you, but maybe before you were sort of numbing those difficult feelings through using alcohol and drugs.
Totally. And I think it's for so many years, I've tried to think, why did I need to, or why do I still need to actually, numb feelings with whatever, Instagram or cookies or, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be drinking drugs, but, and I think it's such a combination of, genetics, it seems to run in my family and certain sides of the family. It's also a huge combination of trauma and my response to that, and also having mild autism and ADHD, being a highly sensitive person and finding life difficult and overwhelming. There's one of the poems in This Skin I'm In is about feeling like the light and sound just assaults me. Sometimes I feel like I hope in this world I just need to be in a dark, quiet room because it all feels far too much. And being able to feel things on me, on my skin, like needing to be in this perfect bubble of comfort because everything feels too much. It's like I say, over the years I've wanted to go, that's the reason why, that's why I'm like it. When I got the ADHD diagnosis, I was like, that's why I am that way. And it's like, well, actually no, all these different strands, and they're all working together to create a unique person who, whose first option will always be to get away from discomfort, always. But actually, it's when we lean into that discomfort and be with huge feelings that actually, we realize that we can survive them, and that that it makes us more whole and I would say happier. That's a bit of the word happy is like, I don't mean happy all the time, like la 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 every day, sunny, but just generally being okay, that acceptance of
the acceptance it's huge, isn't it? I think it's really interesting with those kind of diagnoses, because I've heard people say, they were wondering about seeking a diagnosis and then as an adult, and then felt a bit reticent because they wondered if maybe, what is that going to bring at this stage in my life? How would it help me to know, that I, as a woman, have ADHD? But I think you've put it so well. It's that thing of understanding why certain things do feel very difficult for you. And I always like to sort of describe it as it's almost like a volume dial. And I just really believe that we're all set at slightly different points on that volume dial. And some people, for them, life is just turned up. It's really turned up to the max, and everything is felt so keenly and so intensely. And for other people, their set point is much lower. So their tolerance is different. And I think that's a helpful way of understanding people and just the differences between us all, and that we don't all respond to things in the same way. We won't all, be able to experience or want to do things in the same way, but that's okay. Like, we're not the same.
Yeah. And, just little things like, I remember being, when I was young, I remember we went to like a holiday park, and we were supposed to do this like canoeing type thing. And we had to put these wetsuits on, which were still a bit wet and had sand in them. And that for me is the worst. I mean, it's like a nightmare. And I remember screaming. I was like, I can't believe it. And they were, my whole family, because they didn't understand. They were like, what's wrong with her? She's so dramatic. Like, she's so sensitive. What's wrong with her? And I was, and kind of not in a mean way, but kind of, making fun of it really. And I'd always felt, I'm too much. There's something wrong with me. it's like, no, there isn't actually, you know. And I can understand when, say, if I'm going to sit my son, you know, George is also autistic, but you know, his autism is not high functioning. And when I took him to his new school and they went to put one of these plastic, what do you call them, overalls on to play with the water spray. And I remember thinking, like, oh my God, that couldn't go near me. And as soon as they tried to put his arm in, he went, and took his arm. And I thought, I totally get it, man. I totally get you.
Yeah.
And other people, it's just an overall. And I'm like, no, but it's not to him and it's not to me. I can understand how he feels about a lot of his kind of sensory issues and tactile defensiveness. I'm like, yeah, I get it.
It's great that you can have that empathy. Yeah, that you really understand and feel what it must feel like for him and why he must find things like that so difficult. Yeah, that's really helpful. But the really amazing thing about you, Ebony, is that you investigate your experiences creatively in your poetry. And that requires an enormous degree of being able to be objective, being able to step back and really see your experiences. Because I think, especially when there's trauma, we're so enmeshed in those experiences that we can't actually look at them and allow ourselves to feel them or to describe them or to really observe them. And I'd love to know how you started writing, because you've just really blown up on Instagram. Your writing is amazing and you have achieved so much success with it. I really believe because you're so honest and open in what you say. It's really, really beautiful writing. But I'd love to know, how did you get there? How did you get to that point where you could see things with that lens and then actually put it into writing?
So I've all my life I've kind of written bits and bobs on and off, and I've always loved writing, but I never really made time for it. And was always, you know, in inverted commas, too busy with work, and you know, and the thought of sharing my writing, I only started really writing. I've written poems over the years. I'd written the odd poem here and there and put it in a folder and kind of put it away. I'd certainly never showed them to anyone or read them aloud to anyone. And it was actually during lockdown. So March last year, when everything first started, I started writing poetry. And the first poem that I wrote I spent a really long time on it, and it came quite from my head rather than from my stream of consciousnness. And I kept thinking, oh, it's taking me ages to write this. And I wrote about not my own experience, but I wrote about what was happening to the world as as an experience, and realizing that actually it was totally mirroring the way that I felt about myself. But at that point, I wasn't able to write in the first person. You know, it was too much. It was too vulnerable. So I wrote about this, you know, what was happening to the world with the pandemic, and didn't show it to anyone, you know, just kind of carried on. And so it was only, I think, so my experience is that during that lockdown, there was nowhere to go in terms of getting away from myself. I speak for myself. I was about to say for us getting away from ourselves, but for me, it was like all the things that I do to kind of keep myself, you know, not feeling as much as possible. You know, whether that's, my thing is like, make sure I go to Starbucks and I have a cigarette and I do this and I do this and then I complete my to-do list and you know, and all of a sudden it was like, there is fucking nothing and nowhere to go to get away from this. And the natural thing for me was to start writing. I felt in quite a lot of pain. You know, there was a lot of denial being shattered by this having to be present. And it felt quite cruel, actually. And it really, the poetry started as a way to try and deal with that pain, because I needed a new way of dealing with it. You know, prior to that, you know, for as long as I can remember, 15 years, I had been to therapy every week. You know, I've been to my AA meetings, I've been to CODA meetings. You know, I've had a rigid support system in place, as well as, you know, all the other things that we do to keep ourselves afloat. And that was just all gone. It felt like, you know, there is nothing. And so the writing came, and it got bolder and it got braver the more I wrote. And I still, at this point, the thought of showing my poems to one person, this sounds like really dramatic, but felt like I might die from being seen for who I really am. And it felt terrifying. And I really challenged myself. And I remember sitting on a park bench with my closest friend in the world, Jordana, and I said, I'm going to try and read a poem to you that I've written. And she was like, great. And I was like, oh, and I just kept looking away, and I said, turn around. I can't do it. Ah! And I was really thankful that I had my COVID mask on, because I thought, this makes it a little bit easier. So I thought, if I could just put some sunglasses
and a hat,
and then maybe use one of those voice changing things, then maybe I can read it. This was a year ago. You know, this was how difficult it was. And over the last year, you know, the poetry has it's gone from, you know, sharing one poem online, and then like you said, suddenly I've been really, really lucky that lots of people have been interested in it and wanted to read it and shared it, and it's suddenly become the most important thing in my life, other than my people. You know, it's become something that heals me, something that helps me, and something that helps me to step out into the world and be brave and show who I am inside. Because, you know, for so many years, this kind of trying to keep this mask of perfection and like, you know, and don't let anyone see who you really are, because then, you know, because the shame that will, you know, if they see who you actually are and what you actually think, they will definitely hate you and abandon you and reject you, you know. And so the poetry, I started writing a lot about my, you know, experiences as being a survivor, and I started writing poetry about motherhood and my son and my experience with him. And I haven't shared too much of that, but what I have shared mainly is these ideas of living in a body that is dissociated and that has gone through a lot of trauma and, you know, a lot of addiction and a lot of difficult, I was about to say negative experiences, but I just call them difficult experiences now, because much as cliche as it sounds, I don't think I would change anything that's happened to me, because it literally, you know, I am who I am because of those things. And it does sound cliched, sorry, it really does. But yeah, you know, and for me, sometimes I'd look back at poems I'd written and think, who wrote that? Like, you know, and often I'll be writing at 1 o'clock in the morning once George is asleep. He is not a sleeper. So he's up till God midnight. And then I'm like, and then I'm just like, and I think I should be going to sleep because I've got to get up in the morning. And I'm like, I just want to write this poem. And then the next day I'll be like, oh, I don't remember writing that. Who wrote that? And I'm like, oh, right. This is interesting. So this is how I feel when I'm in a stream of consciousness and I'm just letting it pour. And that is the thing that is healing all this trauma, you know. And I read something not long ago about how when people write poetry, they can literally see it on brain scans, how it changes PTSD. And, you know, I was diagnosed with PTSD years ago alongside all my other names that I've got: depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, ADHD, you know, like every letter under the sun. And, you know, and I can feel the biggest shift in the last year in myself since I started writing poetry.
Gosh.
That was a really long answer. Don't ask me anything, Yvonne, because I'll just be here all day, blah, 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 blah. It's like, yeah, we need to go now. We've been here for 4 days.
But everything you're saying is just so interesting. And you have so many rich, difficult, very difficult and traumatic experiences, but you have so much to draw on. It's really fascinating to hear what you're saying. So keep going.
Thank you.
So you have achieved success incredibly now in your poetry, that you're going to have a collection published, The Skin I'm In, and by Blood Moon Poetry Press. And you have one particular poem that you wanted to read for us, which you feel really ties in with the moment of tenderness. So I'd love for you to read that for us now.
Yeah, I haven't read this aloud before, and because I'm quite disorganized and have ADHD, I haven't practiced it either. So let's see how it comes out. So this poem is definitely about the moment of tenderness and about the letting go of shame as a whole. And it's called Uncuffed. And one day, as the snow fell soundlessly, a white space became to replace my center, pregnant with disgrace for the longest gestation, the birthplace of untruth, seeded in my youth. As I plucked the self-fired arrow of blame from my tender heart and emptied out the shame into a litter bin, gave her a new name, wiped my tears with kitchen roll, rough on flimsy skin, thickening, and walked out of the shade, uncuffed, cheeks touched with pale sunlight, scuffed trainers cast aside, the swallow gliding in quiet celebration, who saw me serve time for this imagined crime, and wondering how and why I ever could have thought me unbeautiful.
Oh, so beautiful. Thank you. I love the last line as well. And I feel that's so moving and something that all of us struggle to realize about ourselves, this sense of how could I have ever thought that I was to blame? How could I have ever thought that how could I have never seen myself for who I really am? But yet, it's the hardest thing.
And it's so easy for me to see it in other people. I can, particularly in my work as a birth doula, I've heard hundreds of birth stories, and I've heard hundreds of mothers say, if I hadn't have done that, this wouldn't happen. And, I'm not talking things on the same scale. I haven't supported anyone who's been through similar to what I have, but it's so easy for me to go, of course that wasn't your fault. Of course it wasn't, and to encourage people to be kind to themselves and forgive themselves and but when it came to me, it was like, no, and it's all shame. It's just this big pile of shit, actually.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I completed a course in mindful self-compassion, it was created by Kristin Neff, and she's really fascinating. So I did her course in self-compassion, and it was a live online training. So there were about 13 of us all around the world, and we'd all come together live each week. And it was really fascinating to experience how difficult everybody found it to offer kindness and tenderness to themselves. And it was a really shared common experience of, in a heartbeat, I would tell my best friend, don't blame yourself for that. You have done this, you've done that. Everyone was doing it. Everyone could do it so easily, but to do it to themselves, it was a struggle, and really, really fascinating to kind of observe that and witness why that is and why we all feel that way. I wanted now to just talk a bit about some of these experiences that you've had. Your son, George, who I know you describe as the love of your life, is 6 now. And his birth was obviously very, very traumatic. I wonder if you could describe something of that experience for us, and start with the pregnancy and how that was.
So I had always wanted to have a baby, and I was really ready and excited, and unfortunately had a very difficult pregnancy. So I think mainly as a result of stopping smoking and coming off my antidepressants all at once. And at that point, I had done a lot of therapy, but I hadn't worked through my trauma, to the degree that I have done now. So there were all of these feelings that had been, quite suppressed for a long time, suddenly came flooding in, along with the hormones, along with the fear of the change and my body changing and all the other stuff that brings up. And so I had really severe depression during my pregnancy. I also had severe sickness and nausea, which for me just, lasted the whole way through. Oh. The good news is that the day after I had him, it completely vanished. There was the trauma of the birth to deal with, but in terms of health again, I did. The hormones settled down. I started taking my medication, and I started smoking again. Not that I'm advising that as a good health measure, but it was for me. So.
I don't think it's often, sorry to interrupt, I don't think it's often talked about how difficult pregnancy can be and how it can trigger things emotionally. But physically, I think there is this kind of rosy picture of pregnancy that's very much, you can see it everywhere on Instagram, and it can be a really challenging experience. I actually wrote a piece on antenatal depression for a magazine. Yeah. And some of the women I spoke to, I think it's just really important to talk about it, because I think one of the hardest things, and this is going back to the shame and it's that thing of why, what's wrong with me that I'm feeling like this? So there's the feeling that's difficult, but then there's the double, the pain that you layer on top of that, which is, well, what's wrong with me for feeling like this? And I think it's really important to normalize that it can be extremely difficult being pregnant, the hormones that it releases in the body and things that it can trigger. Yeah. It was not what I was expecting at all. I just, I remember weeing on the stick and thinking, oh my God, I'm pregnant, this is amazing. And I was fine for about maybe 2 weeks, and then it just suddenly all went very, very, very downhill. So what sort of things were going on with you? You had physical, you had the sickness, I had the sickness and the depression and severe dissociation, and really, lots of suicidal thoughts and feeling like I couldn't exist. I just couldn't be here. I didn't want to die, but I didn't want to be here at all. And didn't know how I could get through. Oh gosh, it must have been so difficult. And did you manage to get help through that?
Not really is the answer. I remember driving to a walk-in medical centre when I was about 11 weeks, and I had, like I said, I'd come off my antidepressants that I'd been on for a long time, just cold turkey, and stopped smoking, went along here, and I went there because I was very concerned that I didn't know what would happen because I was in such a terrible state. Yeah, and I said I need medication and I need it now. Yeah. And this doctor said, well, you can't take that when you're pregnant. And I said, you don't understand. You're not hearing what I'm saying. You don't understand. I cannot do this. Like I cannot, I can't continue the pregnancy, or I can't continue to live unless you help me. And they didn't. And I went home and I found my old packet of amitriptyline, and I started taking that again. I then got my doctor on board, got an appointment, got that sorted out, and it helped a little bit. It helped a little bit, but not hugely. Again, I tried to find some groups and some support, for antenatal depression, but it was just so not talked about. And the one group I did find, I felt so ill and so sick, and I paid for a taxi to take me all the way there. It was miles away. And I got there and it was all people who had postnatal depression and no one who was pregnant. And I just felt so alone. I just thought, you know. Yeah, so it was a pretty awful experience, but
definitely a lot. I
got
lot
something
more
wonderful out of it in the end.
And I think a lot more needs to be done around antenatal depression, definitely. And then the birth. So there's the kind of excitement of it and the relief that you've had the baby and that you're feeling more like yourself. But what happened during the birth to cause the problems that have happened with George?
So it's really difficult to pinpoint exactly when and how the brain damage occurred.
Okay.
But what happened was I was 33 weeks pregnant and my waters went. And I also had group B strep.
Right.
And, had I have been 37 weeks plus, that wouldn't have been such a cause for concern. But what happened was I had gone along to the hospital, and what I know now is that the protocol should have been that I was not I won't use the word allowed because that's never the right term, but the protocol should have been that the waters shouldn't have been gone for any longer than 16 hours, given that I had group B strep and given that the baby would have been preterm. But that wasn't picked up. And so I was sent home. So I was told that I would be induced in a week because when I was 34 weeks to give the baby more time to grow. And so had been at this point 63 hours with the waters gone. And then I actually went in to talk about my birth preferences. And while I was there at the end of the meeting, I just said, "Oh, can you listen into the baby before I go?" And she said, "Yeah, that's fine." So she got someone to listen in, and I could see her face kind of drop, and said, "We need to get the consultant." And it was very suddenly, we need to do an emergency cesarean. The baby's heart rate, which we know now, baby's heart rate was pathological. But the other issue was that there wasn't a theatre available. And so I was left for quite a long time in this state. And so up until very, very recently, we had assumed that that's when the brain damage occurred. But we got some scans and some more information recently that would suggest that actually the brain damage was not caused by him being left in there for that time and wasn't caused by the infection. So this is all really new information to me, and I'm still processing it myself. But what we do know is that he had a major stroke sometime around the time of the birth. It could have been just before, it could have been just after, it could have been during, but that it freakishly wasn't caused by that chain of events, which we always thought it was, but it wasn't apparently. And so he was born, not breathing, and had, like I said, his heart rate had been low for a very long time. Was taken straight to intensive care, so I didn't see him. I didn't see him for about 9 hours actually after he was born, and then I just saw him through the incubator for a few minutes, and then was very off my head on pethidine and opioids. So it's I'm kind of laughing about it when I'm like, oh, it just makes me really sad. I've got a picture of me with my hands going through the little portholes in the incubator and kind of touching him for the first time, but I can't really remember it. And so it feels sad. But he was in intensive care for about a week, and then we were in total for about 3 weeks. So I was left on the postnatal ward, which was really shit because I didn't have my baby with me and was with 4 other women with their babies who were crying all night. So that was 17 days of, it was really difficult. And so like I say, we now are not sure when it happened or exactly how it happened. But I suppose the most important thing for me is to know that there's nothing that I could have done there's nothing that I could have done to change it. There's nothing that I did wrong.
Yeah.
You know, it was always, should I have gone in sooner? What if I had have done this? What if I had been a medical doctor and knew about group B strep levels? And what if this? And actually, it turns out it was just one of these things that just happened. You know, it just happened. And while the birth was traumatic and the care wasn't good, it seems now that that wasn't actually the cause of it. So yeah, just trying to kind of process that. And it's such new information for us that you know, what we thought it was is now suddenly not what we thought it was. And so
the whole experience was hugely, you know, traumatic and completely out of your control. But yeah, having a baby always is. It's like one of those big things in life. It teaches us. It's like the ultimate lesson in you are not in control of life. But for you, that was completely magnified and intensified. And those weeks and months and years after, you must have just been trying to process everything and trying to understand it all, and then get used to, you know, this new life that you had. How did that impact in your relationship with your partner, Steve?
You know, when I look back over the last 6 years, I look back on how Steve and I have coped with so much pride. I'm so proud of us as a couple for coming through what we've come through. And particularly because, you know, George had, that's my son, George had multiple diagnoses, and they were very spread out. So, you know, when he was born, we didn't know that he'd suffered any brain damage. You know, we didn't know that he was blind, which, you know, we later found out was a genetic issue. And so, you know, we had this little lovely baby. You know, we were trying to get over the trauma of the birth. And then, you know, about 4 or 5 months in, I thought, you know, this little prem baby, I'm thinking he's still not making any eye contact. He's not kind of tracking what's going on. And I'd taken him twice to the doctors and said, I'm not sure there's something right with his eyesight. There's something wrong. I'm not sure. And they said, no, he's fine.
So you just knew, you had that knowing, didn't you? As a mother, you knew.
Yeah. You know, and I didn't have any experience of prem babies, and I kept thinking, oh, maybe it's just because he was born early, you know, and he's catching up. But I knew something was right, and I didn't want to know. I really didn't.
Yeah.
But what happened was, eventually we took him to a private pediatrician, and he looked at him and he said, I'm so sorry you've had to pay to come and see me, because, you know, he's blind. It looks like to me like he's totally blind. And so, you know, he was amazing. He said, come to Moorfields tomorrow and we will fast track you. Come to A&E and I will fast track you into the system, because this should have been picked up earlier.
Yeah.
So from there, you know, we got the news that he was blind. And you know, I can't even, I'd be here all day if I went into each diagnosis and how we processed it. But as we were in complete grief and trauma around that and trying to come to terms with it, the hospital has said we are going to arrange a brain scan to look at the cause of the blindness, you know, whether it's genetic or whether it's the nerves, the optic nerves. So they arranged this brain scan. He had the general anaesthetic and MRI. And then another month later, they called us in and said, we've got some news for you. He's not only blind, he's blind. Turns out he's blind from a genetic disorder, but he's also suffered brain damage, and that's a separate thing. So, right. So we then had the blindness diagnosis, the brain damage diagnosis, which we just couldn't handle at that point. It was too much. It was like we were still trying to, you know, process the blindness. So I kind of parked the stroke for a long time. I was just like, that doesn't exist. I'll just deal with the blindness, you know. We then, another 4 months later, got another part of the picture was that the type of genetic disorder he has is quite a rare version of it, which means that they said that he has a very high chance of having complete kidney failure as well. So that was the next bit. And then a year later, we were told he was autistic and intellectually disabled. And, so it was just like, when I look back at how me and Steve have coped, I heard a statistic once, and I can't remember the numbers, but it was the outcome of people, clean and sober addicts meeting in recovery, and the chances of their relationship surviving is next to none. So we'd always said, we're the exception. We're both clean and sober. We met in recovery. We've been together 15 years now. And then there were also a set of statistics about special needs parents and how many survive, going through the trauma of it, the grieving process, and the day-to-day managing of it. And again, was really, really low numbers. And Steve was like, well, we're 1 in a million, we're still together. And it's been hard. We both do our separate recovery. We both do weekly therapy, and we support each other. But it was really difficult. It put a lot of pressure on us. And particularly, I think, for Steve, seeing me go through all that kind of self-hatred and because of my previous experiences, blaming myself. He said it was really painful to watch you in such a painful place for so long, and to and I had quite a lot of bitterness, and I'm generally a very, very big-hearted, open-hearted person, but I felt very angry and very bitter. If I wasn't blaming myself, I was blaming the hospital. I was like, who the fuck is responsible for this? Like, who has done this to our child? Who's done this to us? Yeah.
Oh, wow. It sounds like you and Steve literally are 1 in a million. And obviously you are very deeply connected to each other. And you're also very aware of yourselves and how, events are impacting on you. And then I think it always starts with awareness. So it sounds like you both have a really good sense of that. You did go through therapy, didn't you, together? Did you go through therapy together around to deal with the birth, or was it separately?
It was separately, actually. Yeah. So we were already both doing therapy before he was born, but we obviously then spent probably a good 3 years of weekly therapy talking about George, and and still now, I still talk a lot about my original trauma and all that stuff, but I regularly I'm going there with my feelings around George and my feelings around who he is and who he isn't, who I thought he might be. There's that the day-to-day beauty and pain of having a child with special needs, and the processes of it's like when you look at the grieving process, there's anger, there's denial, there's grief, there is loss, there is acceptance, there is, and then you get new waves of it as new milestones come along or don't come along. He's just recently started at a special needs school, so that's another big process for us to get our heads around. And but Steve is 1 in a million. He's great, and to think that when I first saw him, I just thought, oh yeah, he's my type, he's good looking. I like him. And little did I know that he's just a fucking amazing person. I just thought, oh, I fancy him. I was only 24 when I met him, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you were very very lucky. You're obviously right where you were meant to be in that moment. So.
Yeah.
So the process of therapy, there, lots of people go through trauma, and not everybody does seek therapy or manage to go through therapy for various reasons. But can you just describe how it's helped you? What has therapy done to help you with the process of acceptance and presence?
I think first of all, having a person who is there every week in the same room at the same time, regardless, and who is emotionally unattached to the situation. It's like, this space is just for me, like I don't have to really think about your feelings, and I don't have to think about, giving you space to speak, or your side of it. That's really fundamental. We've also we've done quite a lot of body work as well, so we'll do things like holding parts of the body and massage while we're kind of talking through things. That's been really helpful. But I think more than anything, it's uncovered all these thousands and thousands of layers that I didn't know how to take off myself, and that had built up over the years. So many layers have built up over the years. And there's something that people say in recovery about another layer of the onion. Like, how many more fucking layers are there of this? It's a never-ending onion. But really, just being able to find out who I am and get to know myself and what works for me, and how I think and how I feel and how I deal with things, has just enabled it all to kind of come together. And also showing up there every week for myself and paying that money that sometimes is difficult to afford, when there's me and Steve both doing it on a weekly basis. It's not, and it's not something that everyone can afford, and sometimes it's a real stretch for us. But actually the worth that comes for me from going, okay, I'm going to do that rather than buy myself a pair of shoes, which I will never wear because I hate wearing heels. But I like to buy heels.
Like to look at them, but
I like to look at them, but I can't walk in them. But and also just finding the right therapist. He has just been so kind and compassionate and wonderful, but also has pushed me sometimes and said, and I've said, well, I can't do this. And he said, I think you can actually. I think you can. And why don't you read that poem to me aloud? And I'm like, no, I'd rather die. Now he's like, oh, so you're having a poetry book published. I thought you were never gonna show your poems to anyone. I'm like, yeah, I am.
So he's showing you your progress. He's holding up a mirror all the time to it and showing you how amazingly you're doing. And I mean, it's incredible what you've just said there. So it's that space, it's kind of creating that space, that sacred space that you don't veer from. You show up there every week, and then you also are becoming aware of all these stories that you've taken on. You've just taken on story after story about you and what this thing that happened, what that means about you. And then it's actually holding up those stories to the light and seeing them for what they are, not as truth, but just as a belief, and then uncovering them. And I suppose just, gently, gradually shedding them. So that's really...
I really like what you said about uncovering and shedding. And, the title of the book that's coming out next week, it's called This Skin I'm In. And it took me a long time to come up with the title. I was like, what is it? It's about the body. It's about layers of the body, And I remember having a conversation with someone, and I said, and it's just so hard, like this skin I'm in, like being in this body. And the skin is the thing that contains all the stories, And so the poems in the book, the way that I've kind of summarized it is, it's holding up a microphone to each organ and each bone and each bit of tissue that wants to tell its story and go, well, I felt like this when when the trauma happened, and actually my heart felt like this, and my liver experienced this, and my bones felt shot to shit. It's kind of, and then it's all, so it's like I've kind of taken the skin off, got each organ out in therapy and gone, okay, what did this one feel like? What did this one? And then kind of put them all back together again and saying, I'm going to mend you. I'm going to stitch you back together, put your skin back on and mend you, and you'll be whole. And that's really what the whole book is about.
That is so clever. And so it's very, very visual. And I think it's bringing awareness to what we were talking about earlier, this sense of you hold trauma in your body, in all the different parts of your body. And you can bring awareness to that, which is exactly what you're doing through these writings. And I also think, just for our listeners to be aware of that very fact. It's a real thing. It's what happens when even when you are triggered into a very momentary state of fight or flight, that stays in your body unless you are able to release it. And when those states are really, taking over your life, as they have done with you, there's a lot of it in there to weigh you down. So it's in there, isn't it? In your bones, in your joints, in your muscles, in your tissue, and so incredible and so beautiful that through your writing, you're like kind of zooming in on all these different parts of you where these traumas have lodged themselves, and then you're kind of interrogating it and investigating it and describing it, and
it's a painful but beautiful process. And I can't even tell you how different I feel in terms of, I felt like I would never forgive so many things in my life, or that I could never forgive myself or the person that had done it, and actually I can't say that every day is like rosy and joyful, because life is just not like that. But what I can say is that I feel quite at peace with most of the things that have happened. I feel like, like it's all okay. And yes, I still struggle with difficult feelings around those things, but it feels like they've been processed as much as they possibly can be at this point. And there will be more processing to do, because it never ends. But I feel that, all the things that were keeping me stuck in addiction and were keeping me in really negative patterns of thinking and behavior and feeling, and, all the difficulty that I was in, and the extreme pain that I was in has changed. It has changed. And that's what I wanted the message of the book to be, is to people who are going through difficulties, whether it's grief, whether it's trauma, whether you're a survivor of abuse, whatever you're going through, that there is healing. Healing is possible.
Healing is possible.
Even on the very, very, very darkest days where it feels like you don't want to be alive anymore and you can't do it and nobody understands. It's like, the moon is always out there. It's always out there. And you can sometimes it is about holding on until you can get there. And other times it's kind of clawing your way there and going, oh, I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give up. And also the biggest part for me is just not doing it alone. I write my poems alone, but I have to force myself to call people and engage with people and tell them how I'm feeling and connect, just connect.
To connect. Yes. Amazing how challenging that can be. I know I feel the same. I live away from my family and friends, and actually, interestingly, when I'm feeling at my worst is when I find it hardest to connect. And it's such a kind of paradox always to me. I'm like, why I feel that way, but I think it can also be a common experience. But what you're talking about, which I think is so interesting and so helpful, is that it's a type of acceptance. And I think when we talk about acceptance, it can be hard for people to hear, because especially when there's been severe trauma, I think there's always this tendency to say, well, no, I don't accept it. I didn't want this thing to happen. So if I could undo it, I would. So why would I accept it? But I think that's kind of missing the point. I think the acceptance is first of the fact that in life, there will always be painful things that will happen to you. Always. In everyone's life, it's unavoidable. And then when something difficult does happen, it's accepting that you're finding it difficult. It's accepting that it's painful. It's accepting that it's having this difficult impact on you and your life. And then you go from there. And that's exactly what you're talking about. It's exactly what you've done. And I think it will be so inspiring for so many people who've struggled and who are struggling with difficult experiences in their life to hear the journey that you are on and the journey that you've you've gone through. We have just had the most amazing, mind-blowing conversation. I feel we need to sort of think about coming to an end now, much as there's still so many things I'd like to talk about with you. But I also think that we've gone in some really interesting directions. And I wanted to finish with a question that I always ask my guests, which is about the tenderness revolution, and the idea behind it are, as in the tenderness revolution, which is this quality of tenderness that we have for ourselves and others, is the 3 C's. And they enable us to fully see, I think, the truth about the way things are. And the 3 C's are courage, curiosity, and compassion. And I wanted to ask you, Ebony, if you had to choose one of these qualities, one that you feel means the most to you in your life, what would you choose out of curiosity, courage, and compassion, and why?
I was listening to your podcast last week in the car, and I heard you ask this question, and I thought, oh, what would my answer be? And I straight away went, courage. Absolutely, courage. It would be my answer. The reason for that is that, so courage is something that I value greatly in myself and in others. And I think, curiosity and compassion are endlessly important. But in order for me to get to compassion for myself in particular, I need to have courage. I need to have a fuckload of courage, because it doesn't come naturally. In order for me to share a poem and talk to you today, and, without going, I can't do it, takes a hell of a lot of courage. But every time we do those things that scare us, we become a little bit more of who we really are. We've despite our fear, we've had the courage and we've done that thing anyway. And we just become a bit more like, yeah, I can do those things. Yeah. And I did do that, and I was okay. And then the next time, maybe it's not quite so difficult, and we don't need to muster up so much courage. But, it's the courage to do those things that don't feel like huge things. I'm going to give you a really random example. I wanted to have a fringe, and I'd never had a fringe before. And I thought, well, I can't carry off a fringe. I'm not cool. I'm not a person who has a fringe. And I don't know why I'm talking about this, Yvonne. Stop me now.
Do it.
I thought, fuck it, I'm going to have a fringe cut. So I had it cut, and I thought, people are going to be like, who does she think she is? And it sounds like the tiniest, stupidest thing, because it's such a surfacey outside thing. But it just made me think, I can do whatever I want to do. Yeah. I can be a poet. I thought, I can't be a poet. Who do you think you are, writing a poetry book? I'm like, I can have a fringe and write a poetry book if I want to. I can be whoever I want to be. I can do whatever I want to do. I've just got to kind of pray for that courage and feel that fear and just go for it anyway. And also, when I am feeling that fear, hold someone's hand through it. Ring my best friend, ring my sponsor, ring my partner or my mum, and just say, I'm feeling really, really scared. And, just not be alone in it. And courage is everything for me.
Gosh. Oh, that's so brilliant. I love that. And you talking about courage, it makes me think about the way I envisage courage as part of this thing of tenderness. And I think it's, for me, it's that thing of I think Glennon Doyle said, we can do hard things.
We can do hard things.
It's really, really fucking hard, but we can do hard things. And then the other part of it is that courage, it's not always what we think courage to be. It's not always that thing of pushing yourself. Sometimes the courage is actually to see yourself and to really to understand who you are. And it's the courage to go within and to actually connect to who you are, and then to show that out into the world, to put that true self out there into the world. So
you've literally, that's it, Yvonne. I wish I'd said that. Yeah, the courage to see yourself.
I loved what you said.
To see yourself. Yeah.
Well, Ebony, thank you so much for your time. I feel like I've taken up too much of your time already.
No, I've loved talking to you. I could talk to you all day. It's been wonderful. You're such the way that you speak, and it makes me feel really comfortable, and you're really kind, and I just think it's wonderful what you're doing. It's just
thank you. I can't say how much I've enjoyed your openness. It's quite rare to speak to someone who can really honestly look within and then speak from the heart, and you have done that so profoundly. So I really, 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 really appreciate that. So thank you again.
You so much. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Tenderness Revolution. I hope you come back for more, because my aim with this podcast is to help us become more aware of these moments of kindness and compassion and how they shape our lives, and enable us to feel more connected to the world around us.